Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set live is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific. I'm looking at a kid from Nyakajeme who is dapper.
Likewise, I'm trying to look up to you, my friend.
Really?
Good, yeah. A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask some pertinent questions. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues on the African continent, but maybe let's start right here in our capital, Washington. So, Shaka Ssali, we just had some interesting elections here in the United States. Democrats seem to have won the hearts and minds of a lot of people. They won the House of Representatives, but the Senate remain in the hands of the Republicans. What does this mean when you look at it from the larger context?
You know, when the framers of the Constitution were putting together that very important or most important document, they had in mind a democracy. And they wanted democracy because most of the descendants of those who had in fact run away from Europe, which was under dictatorship and what have you, wanted to make sure that they were ruled or governed fairly. They wanted to avoid the idea of somebody getting mad with power and becoming a dictator. And so they introduced the system of checks and balances. And those checks and balances would be reflected in the three different independent branches of government. It would be the executive, which would be led by a president who would be residing in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. And then there would be Capitol Hill, which would be made up of Congress or the legislature. And that would be the Senate, the upper house, and the lower house would be the House of Representatives, which would get into the business of checks and balances. And then you would have a third branch, which is the judiciary system, which also would be checking the other two branches. So what you have right now, you have the Democrats winning the House of Representatives, whose constitutional role, by the way, is oversight. What does it do? Basically, it is there to check the executive. It's looking at his back and it is saying, no, you can't cross the line. And so basically what you have really at the end of the day, you have what normally is referred to as gridlock. They have to work together in order to have something done in this town. They have to figure out a way of doing work together, or they will probably sink politically, both of them, rather than swim, actually. And so it's going to be very interesting, especially given that you have about 2 years, by the way, to the presidential elections.
And President Trump has drawn the line in the sand. He has said, you know what, look here, guys, yes, you won, but we won the Senate. So if you want us to work together, we can work together. But if you're going to, in any way, try to impede what I'm trying to work on, it's not going to work. How do you characterize that kind of statement that he gave?
I think that he probably needs to be a little bit magnanimous, really, because let's face it, you do have, yes, the Democrats actually won big, really, when you come to think about it, because again, that House of Representatives, my friend, it can do a lot of things. It can do the job of investigations, for example. You still have the issue of the independent counsel. You're talking about the issue of whether or not Russia may have interfered in the last election. You know, that investigation is still ongoing. And the House of Representatives has a huge say in that. There are some other things that they look at. And again, the other thing is that the purse, for example, money is controlled by who? By the Congress. The House of Representatives, it has a committee which is called Ways and Means Committee. The chairman of that committee is supposed to be perhaps the most important person really in this town. And so, yes, the president, for example, can come up with a budget and what have you, but at the end of the day, in order for him to actually get the money and the money to be disbursed, you know, to wherever he wants, he has to figure out a way of working with the House of Representatives.
Earlier, you talked about checks and balances. What is the significance of that, especially in the context of how a lot of African countries operate? When you're the president, you literally control the purse, you control everything. You actually turn the national purse into sometimes your personal ATM. How would you maybe compare and contrast?
Well, you know, the thing is, it shouldn't really be like that, because when you look at some of these constitutions, on paper, they do have these types of powers, really, in order for them to do the jobs of oversight, just like they do here. But in reality, the president, the chief executive, controls everything, like you said. In fact, in some cases, could actually even control your oxygen in order for you to actually have unfettered access to air and breathe for your life. In some cases, you might need a nod from an African president. Not the entire, by the way, continent. There are a few countries, frankly, which are getting it right. In fact, when you look at South Africa, for example, frankly, South Africa, in fact, is the beacon of hope for African democracy so far. You know that they have recalled presidents, not one, but two, you know, since they got the multiracial elections and got their freedom. So South Africa, watch South Africa. It could actually be the leader in terms of democracy in Africa. But when you look at, for example, a country which has the distinction of having the longest serving president on the continent, and that is Equatorial Guinea, for example. You're talking about Theodore Obiang Basogo. That man, you know, and you remember, his son, one of his sons actually, was using a credit card of the government of Equatorial Guinea to buy suits in Paris, to buy all sorts of things. So those things happen.
How about people who argue? You gave a very good example of South Africa. They say South Africa is more progressive, more okay, in terms of how they fight corruption. They are, compared to other countries, they do a much better job. For instance, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was called out for some corruption scandals that were involved during his campaign, and he has vowed to pay that money back, actually to refund the people who paid for some things within his party. Is that something that we would likely see here happening in the United States?
Yes, I think that, yeah, well, first of all, I mean, let's face it, there are institutions that take care of those types of things. If such a thing happens, of course, someone was called out. There's no question about it. In fact, in South Africa, Ramaphosa is not doing it because of altruism. He's doing it largely because you do have institutions in place which actually do their jobs. You do have an independent judiciary, there's no question about it. You do have an independent legislature in South Africa. And in fact, you do have a democratic ruling party, the African National Congress.
What lessons can be learned from the example of the United States having this balance of power?
Well, if you have that type of balance of power, then it probably means that you don't risk ending up with a dictator. You end up having, for example, arriving at policies that run the country on the basis of debates. You have an environment that allows the people to talk about the issues that affect them. And in fact, reaching a point where they agree that this can actually work for us, and this cannot work for us. And I think that this is something that is very, very important for Africa. As we talked about, you know, during the Straight Talk Africa edition last week, we were talking and emphasizing the need, really, for permanent institutions if Africa is going to really make it. rather than strong men who end up being dictators, really. And as you said, sometimes even turning the central banks into their ATMs. And there's a lot of evidence to boot that that is in fact is happening in a lot of countries. That's part of the reason why that continent is not developing. That is part of the reason why, for example, those governments are not creating an environment that, for example, creates jobs. Africa is one of the continents, for example, where when you think about the changing demographics, the young people increasingly are becoming the majority. They are not invested in the status quo. They have nothing. They do not have jobs. They do not, in fact, have the hope of tomorrow. And so what are you going to do? You need a democratic continent. You need systems that are in place that have the ability and the capacity to respond to the needs of the people in those countries. And so what Africa needs is checks and balances. And checks and balances can only be brought about through permanent institutions, an independent judiciary, an independent legislature, and of course, an executive, which can interact and reach a decision that reflects, for example, policies that are for the benefit of the citizens of that particular country.
Before we move maybe to another topic, let's stay on elections. Let's go further south to Madagascar. They just recently had an election. So far, they don't have an outright winner. It looks like both former presidents, Andre Rajoelina and Marc Ravalomanana, are poised to go in a runoff on December 19th, this coming month. However, the incumbent president is looking like he's going to lose this election. He has not been able to garner at least 10% of the vote.
The incumbent president, indeed. It is interesting that you nearly succeeded at least at pronouncing some of the names of the key players right there. I happen to be, I think, when it comes to pronunciation, at least in terms of the names of Madagascar, and sometimes when I have to pronounce the names of people who come from Poland, I become very, very challenged. The incumbent president in Madagascar, from what I can see here, is Rajaonarimpa Nina.
A very tough name to
pronounce. Very
pronounce.
tough name. Yeah. You have to give him credit, really, because this is a president that has served one term, and he was seeking a second term. But he did not interfere, for example, with the country's electoral commission, because if he actually wanted, just like in a lot of African countries, he could have decided that the results favor him to the extent that he would have had an automatic second term. But here you are, you have a country that is at least conducting an election, frankly, that is a reflection of the will of the people. And this is the reason why, as you said, you have Rajoelina and Ravalomanana, who are going to second round so that one of them will become president, and the gentleman who is in office right now will go home. And of course, as I remember the last time I was in Malawi, I had a very interesting interview with a former Malawian president, Bakiri Muluzi, who actually told me and proved to me that there is, after all, life after State House.
Speaking of Malawi, let's go to a commenter from let's go to Chilinga Kinga Konga Kasam in Malawi. What kind of a leader should the Malawians vote for in the May 2019 elections?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that Malawians are smart enough to look at the different manifestos of the different presidential candidates who are running. Through these manifestos, you can get a sense as what you are actually being promised. If you vote for so and so, that is what you are supposed to be getting. Even though sometimes, when some individuals, work out manifestos or write manifestos and campaign, and somebody once suggested that politicians, in fact, campaign in poetry. They basically promise heaven on earth. But when it comes to the business of governing, when they get the opportunity to actually govern that one, they do in prose. They become sort of realistic. So you have to be very careful, but I think the important thing is you have to look at each individual's manifesto. And then you vote for what he's promising you to do for you and all that kind of stuff. And when that particular individual actually wins and comes to office, you also must hold him responsible and remind him for what he promised, for what he pledged to do when he becomes the chief executive of your country.
Let's go back to Madagascar. We have a comment from Mark. I can't pronounce the last name, but he says it seems to be an interesting narrative going on in Madagascar. He says Andre Rajoelina overthrew Marc Ravalomanana in a popular uprising in 2009. Now the two guys are facing each other again. What does that mean for the future of that country?
Well, first of all, let's face it. I think, in fact, that there has been peace in that country. Because, yes, Rajoelina, with the help of the military and all kind of stuff, was able to overthrow Ravalomanana. But obviously, Ravalomanana has demonstrated that he has staying power.
And he allowed him to come back out of from exile.
It is not Ravalomanana who allowed Rajoelina to come back into exile.
No, Rajoelina allowing Marc Ravalomanana to come back from exile.
He did, but again, this was not because of altruism. It's not because of what he was really, what he wished for and what have you. He was under tremendous, enormous pressure in order for him to do that, so that he could, in fact, access some kind of aid in order for him to start doing real things in the country, because the country was grinding down economically and all that kind of stuff. But I think at the end of the day, what is important here is that these two individuals have a lot of following, whether one likes it or not. They have a lot of following. So at the end of the day, since when somebody says that society is not static, it is dynamic. So people are not static, they are dynamic. Their views can evolve to the extent that they can reach a point where they can agree to work with one another in the interests of their people, in the interest of their country. They have to put the country first, not the egos, not the individual egos. They have to put the individual egos aside and make sure that they put the interests of the country first.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every Tuesday here at the Voice of America. Today, Shaka Ssali is taking your questions, so please feel free to send us those comments and questions. For now, let's maybe cross over to Ethiopia. We've been talking about reforms in Ethiopia. It looks like Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is doing the right thing there. He's empowering women, which is a good thing to do. But at the same time, he has a lot of critics who are out there to get him. They're saying that maybe he's running a little bit too fast. All these reforms that are happening, he's just, maybe there should have been some kind of progression instead of rushing through some of these reforms. Your thoughts?
Yeah, but let's face it, he's doing probably what you would consider to be what is needed to be done, frankly, in order to jumpstart, for example, the Ethiopian economy, in order to provide jobs for the increasingly changing demographics and all that kind of stuff. And besides, let's face it, Ethiopia, from the little I know about it, has never experienced even a single day of democracy. Of fairness, I mean, to be honest with you. And I think this is the man. This man could very well be, again, like I said last week, and I said before, could very well be a legitimate new breed of African leaders. In fact, whatever he's doing, it should not be limited to Ethiopia. I would urge and hope that other African leaders on the continent can actually take a cue from Addis Ababa, can look at the Abiy Ahmed template and incorporate it in their own countries, because it seems to me that is the way to go. He is looking, for example, at some of his former colleagues in the military. Mind you, he is a retired lieutenant general. And he just got a major general recently, a man who was in charge of intelligence and what have you and stuff like that, on allegations of corruption. Some of these other senior officers also have actually been nailed because of allegations regarding their involvement in corruption, that they had almost turned the corruption into an industry. And then you have also business women, businessmen, and all that kind of stuff. And then you also had some of these officials who were abusing power, especially when there were some political prisoners who had been jailed. They were subjected to torture and all sorts of things. And this, by the way, some of these tortures were condemned by some international human rights groups, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And so he's doing the right thing. As a matter of fact, when you look at some of the reforms he has carried out, these reforms have received widespread support from the West especially, and some other democratically oriented, countries globally. So he's doing the right thing. But the question is, does he in fact have incontrovertible evidence that these people in fact were engaged in corruption, that these people were engaged in torture and what have you? And if he does, then he should make sure that these people become at least, in a sense, go through what you would call due process. We would like to look at people going through due process. Now, if they do, the question is, to what extent, for example, is the Ethiopian judiciary system independent? Okay.
How about those people who say that perhaps he's targeting political opponents, that perhaps he's not doing this because he has to do it, he's just trying to appease the ruling party? And there are those who argue that maybe he's selectively picking on some people.
Well, what in fact you are saying is something that has been raised by the chairman of the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. This is, in fact, the most powerful, until recently, party that is part of a coalition that is made of the government, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. TPLF was the party that obviously was run by Meles Zenawi until he died. And it is the party essentially that formed the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which seized the power back in 1991. Now, it so happens that the Tigrayan people, they happen to be a minority. They form about 6% really of the country, but they had disproportionate power because they seized the power using the AK-47. And they have actually, because of that, benefited enormously because they had, for example, access to contracts and all sorts of things. Some of them have, big businesses and you name it and that kind of stuff. Now, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed happens to come from an ethnic community called Oromo. The Oromo are the largest ethnic community in Ethiopia. They also took the blunt because it is their young people who pretty much were in some of these protests.
For 3 years.
For 3 years. And a lot of them, in fact, died and what have you. But eventually, you can see where they are. They seem to be on the verge of helping to bring a new era in Ethiopia, and a new era that seems at least to have given the government an opportunity to embark on what you would call social, political reforms. Do they have challenges? Of course there will be challenges. I mean, in any time when you talk about change, yes, there are people obviously who want to see those changes because they hope to benefit from them, but there are also people that have been having it so good, so well, that they wouldn't want to see anything really changing and taking away some of the privileges that they have been having. And so those are the circumstances that we are looking at. But at the end of the day, it seems to me, from what I read, from some of the people I have talked to from Ethiopia, that this man has a lot of support of the Ethiopian people.
Let's go to some other interesting topic. Every time we've sat on this table, we talk about China-Africa relations. There's an interesting comment from Orek Isaac. He says, what's your comment on the Kenyan president rejecting the sale of Nairobi deal with China?
Well, first of all, I really can't answer such a question because I have not done sufficient homework in order to understand the dynamics. But I'm sure, knowing President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, he is a very smart guy. He must have looked at it and probably judged that this is not in the best interest of his people. And therefore, he decides he's not going to do it.
But wait a minute. Kenya is doing a lot of, China is actually investing a lot of its money in Kenya.
Yeah, yeah.
Wouldn't that be part of the ongoing process of China investments in Kenya?
Yeah, but you see, if you are a smart guy, really, what you need, if you are like a beautiful woman, there are so many people wooing you. What you have to do is to make comparisons and contrasts and perhaps get the best bargain that you can get out of those shooters. And I think that Kenya is in a position where it is only not being wooed by Chinese, but you have the Japanese, you have the Germans, you have the Americans, you have all sorts of people. So I think that the president is in a position, sincerely, to look at those different suitors and make a decision that reflects the best that he thinks will benefit his people.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are looking at the challenges of major social political reforms in Ethiopia.
Let's go to another quick comment from Frank Nwamanya. What are the long-term implications of China-Africa relations?
Well, first of all, I think that at the end of the day, African leaders have, at the end of the day, they have to look at those relations in the context of what is there for their people. I mean, for the most part, Africa, just like before, it has been used by other countries to better themselves at the expense of Africa. The Chinese have technology and what have you. The Africans have the raw materials that the Chinese must have, the Chinese need in order to develop their economy, in order to develop themselves into a superpower, so to speak. Africa can also become a superpower, but can only do so if it begins to add value on their resources.
On that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.